hear speech and language therapists saying not dissimilar things to what Eve has just said about occupational therapists, but with speech and language therapists working together in schools and coming in the end to say the importance of the new research and new project we heard about at the beginning of the session in Ireland. So thank you first of all for the invitation. The presentation will very briefly outline international service delivery models for SLT's work in schools, define terms, and that's a kind of slightly boring thing to do at the end of a conference, but I think it's important to do that. Summarize briefly again the current research findings on pathways, service delivery pathways, note current gaps in evidence, suggest implementation research, much of the type that, again, Eve's been talking about might be used, and again go back to the importance of the work beginning here. So, the international picture. We have got a story across the world of education and SLT services following inclusive educational policies. And the policies across the world, at least much of the world, have similar aims. Raising attainment, definitely, closing gaps in attainment, and placing the child and family at the centre of decision-making. Travelling policy, it comes in to a lot of the ways and policies that people are writing about education. And I'm going just a few examples using SLT for all professional titles. It's the wrong one for most of them, but this is the kind of thing that's going on. In the United States, SLTs are employed in schools, although often through private companies. And they're working under the No Child Left Behind Act. And that means their time allocation and the activities that they do are determined by each child's individual plan. So it's very much focused on educational outcomes for children. New Zealand, again, SLTs employed by the National Ministry of Education, working with children, parents and educators, but not constrained particularly in what they do. Australia, SLTs employed by schools or independently contracted as a school employee, offering a wide range of interventions. And then Europe, the rest of Europe, has got many models, and there is a European cost action which has just summarised provision for children with language disorders in over 36 countries. I've put references at the end, so if anybody wants to know about provision in 36 countries in Europe, we can tell you. You might not want to know, but here we go. In the United Kingdom, SLTs are mainly employed by the National Health Service. Not all, and it's increasingly common in England to have a sort of Australian company model where you're actually employed by a company but working in education. But if we take the health service, they are looking at with a comprehensive SLT service, again to try and include the needs of all children. The legislation in England and Wales is called Every Child Matters. In Northern Ireland, the Special Education Needs and Disabilities Act Northern Ireland. In Scotland, Getting It Right for Every Child. All focusing on co-working, all focusing on education, all focusing on the child's holistic development. So that quick run over suggests differences in funding models, who's paying for the services, differences in goals and functions, differences in intervention aims, how wide are they? Do they include things other than the child's education plan? Processes and environments differ considerably, local legislation and local need. And so each country plans services considering their own priorities and sustainable service delivery options, what it is they can cope with. So when we talk about SLTs and other therapists in schools, there's no one model that we can copy, but there's a lot of ideas that we can think about. Now, in the UK and the Irish demonstration project, we're going to use tiered approaches, and that was the diagram Eve showed with the triangle, with some children at the top and lots at the bottom and some in the middle. And I want to, again, define these tiers a wee bit. They're different in how education use them a little bit and how speech and language therapy services use tiers. Educational services base tiers on child need. So does a child need a specialised intervention or a targeted intervention or a universal, well, everyone gets a universal intervention. SLTs use universal, targeted and individualised, if I can keep with these titles, describing the type of intervention involved. So it's a little bit of a mix, but just to kind of advance it, we've crashed them together and say, let's talk about Tier 1 as universal services, Tier 2 as targeted services, and Tier 3 individualised services. With 1, allowing all children to communicate and to access the curriculum. Tier 2, implement strategies for vulnerable children at risk, which has got a lot of slippy words in it. And Tier 3, individualised services to co-produce support for individual children, who often, but not always, would be those with significant and persistent difficulties. The significant maybe matters to a speech and language therapist if you've got a lateral S sound, so you say shisha, that is not going to impair communication greatly, you're not going to be unintelligible, it's not going to affect your access to the curriculum, but it can be sufficiently noticeable to incur social penalties, bullying. I remember a child in clinic who was hoping to fix this, and he said, what do they say? And he said, at school they say, I talk funny. And what do you say back to them? Likewise, he said. Good on, resilience. But nonetheless, to that child, that would be an important thing, and a therapist would use an individualized approach. So there are differences, but for here, we'll just keep mainly the same ones. I'm going to also take them in reverse, because that's really, I think, how we can look at the evidence. Educational Tier 3 services, SLT individualised services for children with identified speech, language or communication disorders, SLCD, requiring some kind of additional support. And that would be Education Service Tier 3. The therapist individualised bit would be the fact that it was devised for a specific child, aiming to improve their speech-language communication skills and or reduce the impact, increase activity and participation, or perhaps prevent something worse happening, like the child whose lateral S might down the line have become quite a nuisance to them. However, there is confusion. Individualised are delivered by SLTs with, and usually with, non-SLTs, as well as just being delivered by SLTs. So the others would involve school staff, and I'm using a lot of different school staff get involved, clinical support workers, which would be what we would currently call assistants, therapy assistants, and certainly parents and families. And usually a mix, usually several people. And they can be delivered to a child one-to-one or in a group. Content and methods are tailored to the child's profile of strengths and weaknesses and success against their personal targets. So it's important not to mix up individualized with individual therapy, which is usually one-to-one therapy. And some of these confusions do arise. SLTs are responsible for some of the intervention, and they open an episode of care for the child. They say, I'm going to take this child on and conclude when the target is met and discharge, when the duty of care has been discharge the child, and or open a new episode of care. Now, this individualised role is pretty well the one I think usually associated with SLT services. It's the one that I think most people think of when they think of SLTs. Targeted services are for children vulnerable to lower educational and language attainments because of some adverse circumstances. So children living in poverty go in there. You'll remember Sheila saying this morning, some people put children for whom English is an additional language in there, but something that is likely to impede development and impede language and educational progress. But the interventions are not for everybody. They're not intended for all children, they're for a vulnerable group, and success is often measured by how well a group does. Now, SLTs do not open a duty of care. And indeed, one of the issues around targeted provision is that it would not necessarily, children would not necessarily be individually identified to an SLT. A number of the targeted interventions are for children in a group, and schools get them together as a group, and that has tremendous advantages. You don't have to assess in detail, you don't have to get consent from anybody, you don't have child or parent, if you're a school, you've got the right to do this, you don't have to wait until you've got permission before you begin. But it also means that you're looking at a group of children with some unknown characteristics, some children in a group who may or may not have language difficulties, who may or may not be in the group that you think they are. And it's not checked, but from an SLT's point of view, the important thing is they haven't taken on a duty of care. They have a general duty of care to treat everyone equitably and discharge their general duty to the whole population, but an individual child is not got to go through to the end of an episode. And it matters a lot when you're organising services. There can be a targeted impact of reducing the prevalence of language difficulties in the population. If you were to do enough successful targeted intervention, there would be fewer children with difficulties. And to say an SLT or others can do the intervention, but it would very often be a non-SLT, with SLTs either doing training or doing advice. So it's a kind of slightly odd hybrid, but there's a lot of it around. To further confuse, the terms have been used differently, with some writers using intervention carried out by non-SLTs, here targeted, calling it indirect therapy, which is not particularly helpful. Indirect therapy is the bit that is not done by a therapist, but it can be not done by a therapist at any tier. And if you call targeted indirect, you're blurring the distinction between targeted and individualized, and you are messing with clarity around legal and ethical responsibilities. So if you think you're doing an indirect therapy for which you have duty of care, fine. But if you think you're doing a targeted therapy through somebody else and you don't have a duty of care, and somebody comes up and says, well, you didn't assess that child and you didn't plan properly, you're a wee bit vulnerable. So it's quite important to get the definitions sorted out. However, mostly, and for the rest of this presentation, I think small group work for vulnerable children and advice to families and carers and educational staff at Tier 2 would usually be considered targeted. So we can sort of get an idea of what it is with the fuzzy bits around the edge. Tier 1, or universal, high quality teaching for all. SLT services maximise opportunities for all children by providing good communication environments and training others. And again, this was something that the OTs were doing in a similar way. Also, for identification purposes, SLTs would use universal when they're trying to identify the population of children and identify which children have got speech, language and communication disorders, and they are often under-identified. There's good evidence that they're missed. So what I'm going to now do is say, well, what is the research evidence for each tier? If we're going to use tiered approaches, how does it go? And this goes to a recent review of SLT intervention pathways for children just with language disorders, because we can't do everything, but language disorders here meaning language disorders that can accompany any other condition. So children with autism may or may not have a language disorder. Children with cerebral palsy may or may not have a language disorder. So it's a wider definition that was actually accepted by the Irish IASLT, Association of Speech and Language Therapists, in a very good paper last year. And what we did, and the references to this, to support this presentation are at the end, but the recent review was by Susan Ebbles and Vicky Sloanims, who's at Great Ormond Street, Courtney and Julie Dockrell from University College London, and me. And what we did is we reviewed the evidence for each tier on the basis of high quality evidence. Now, what that means is databases that report evidence. So we looked at the Cochrane collaboration, we looked at SpeechBite, which looks at pretty well all SLT interventions, Australian group who actually evaluate them for you, and we looked at Google Scholar. So we took the main databases, and what they're looking at are controlled studies with high quality, which includes things like large enough to show effects and with no biases that can be, or minimum biases that can be detected. So having looked at this, and by the way, that paper is in the International Journal of Language and Communication Disorders Early View, but it's free access. So the journal is not free access, but this particular paper is. There are 3 commentaries, one from Ireland following it, and then a response from the authors. So it's there if you want to look at it. So tier 3 was the traditional role of SLTs, and involving SLTs in tier 3 interventions showed communication gains. There was quite a lot of studies. You could find gains in receptive and expressive language, word finding, grammar, vocabulary, attention, social communication, alternative communication packages. So quite a lot of good evidence. Interesting points, though, often the studies that showed effectiveness were using larger amounts of intervention over longer periods than would be common in UK school contexts. One of the studies we did used 22 hours of therapy per child. And when you say that to Americans, they say, why did you stop there? You know, you need more. And some of the studies showed 60 hours of training for parents and large amounts of training for school staff. So we found evidence, but we found evidence on serious attempts to change. We also found, we reviewed the fact that some interventions that had worked when delivered by the original research team were less successful undertaken by others. And that's a common finding in research, actually. Now, maybe to do partly with the enthusiasm and implementation and fidelity of the original team, but it isn't an unusual finding. And again, when I was involved with the Strathclyde Language Intervention Programme with the Language Therapy Manual, was a randomised controlled trial, full-scale RCT, and it got a reasonable effect size, and it kind of worked. Whether the programme was delivered by SLTs or SLT assistants, and whether it was delivered individually or to small groups of children, up to about 4. But when we moved it over to school staff, taking not enough account of the realities of school staff, we found that we didn't get the same effect. And using historical controls on the Strathclyde Intervention Programme study, we could say, well, it really didn't do very well at all. And one difference was that the school staff delivered less intervention, and they delivered highly varied intervention. So there was actually a factor of 9 between the children who logged the smallest number of sessions were logged, and those who got most sessions. Some got 72, and some didn't. So we're back to the fact to say that probably we've got good evidence at level tier 3. Tier 2 targeted, the one that we kind of hope is going to work, because you can go in and take a group of children in a school and start off without, let's say, the permissions and the assessments. Again, just talking about language disorder, we did find successful Tier 2 language interventions for vulnerable pupils. And the 4 and 5 superscript references there are to the Education Endowment Foundation web pages, which have done lots of this stuff, very well researched, and they have outcome measures and they have programs published. And the other one is the American equivalent, the IES, What Works Clearinghouse. So lots of that going on, but most of it didn't actually include SLTs. It included language interventions delivered successfully within schools, sometimes by school staff, and very often by research staff. SLTs often involved in the original descriptions and original setups of the programs, but without SLTs. And in fact, in the particular study I'm talking about, the Pupils et al. Study, only one Tier 2 targeted intervention included SLTs who trained staff, developed materials and supported delivery, and that was one that did not improve child language skills. It's called Talk of the Town. It had a good start. It had lots of small-scale studies suggesting it would work and should work. It was delivered. Some of the problems Eve raised came up. There was, teachers who weren't kind of quite ready to do it or not too keen on doing it. And there were questions about how well, and this is a big problem for targeted interventions, how well the package fitted the needs of the children, which, remember, are not really assessed individually. So that was the kind of reason that it didn't work, but it not only didn't work, they were looking at improving reading on a language intervention. Well, maybe that's never going to work. But on the language scores, children actually went up a month, except for those on free school meals, which is a very good indicator of poverty, who went down a month. So arguably it was a wee bit harmful. So this is a wee bit of a disappointing finding. Tier 1, well, a considerably disappointing finding. Tier 1 universal interventions for whole classes, and again, educationalists doing this, showed improvements in grammar, morphology, vocabulary, but again, after long interventions. And you can actually add reading text comprehension to that. We did a study of reading text comprehension and found that children with language difficulties did just as well as other children. So that could be done. We hadn't, however, we couldn't really find universal SLT interventions in the databases above the age of 3. Certainly before 3, therapists are doing universal interventions, but when you get into the preschool school age, we just couldn't find them. Professional development for education staff, by the way, there's some interesting studies that find that staff improved their interactions with children, but the children didn't improve their language skills, which is not where our logic model is usually taking us, but that's what happened. Summary. There is evidence of effective SLT practice for Tier 3 individualized interventions. Targeted and universal SLT interventions are under-researched, and on the whole, we don't have great evidence of effectiveness. And the 6th superscript there is from the response of Pupils et al. To the commentaries that we got, just summarizing, saying, well, we're concerned when SLTs deliver consultation or training without an individualized focus. The evidence as it stands is less clear that this has a significant impact on a child's language or broader well-being. So that's the summary. However, this is lack of evidence. It's not evidence of lack. We are getting in the professional literature positively evaluated targeted SLT interventions. If I can tell you that in the RCSLT, the UK SLT organisation conference a year ago, almost exactly, there were 19 poster presentations or presentations at that conference about, about targeted interventions that people thought were great. Some also reported child language gains. There was lots about working together, working well, but also child language gains. But they are mainly unpublished reports from professional conferences and meetings. And as such, do require further research and publication. And it's maddening. You get this sort of lovely summary, and perhaps a wee abstract, And even if you kind of follow up by emailing somebody or phoning the main author, they say, oh, we haven't written it up yet, or we haven't quite finished it yet, or we haven't really got the answers. So we are really looking for Tier 2, Tier 1 interventions. Now, why do we think they might work? Well, we do have some evidence from a project in the Northeast called Language for All, which again we've written up in the International Journal, that professionals think they get enhanced practice through working together. And, they're not likely to be so wrong. And this is a longish quote from that study. Where practitioners and services were highly collaborative and engaged in complex practices. Now, this was in the northeast of England in one local authority, which had had a relatively stable staff and had been working because therapists in schools in the UK have been there forever. And they've been working closely across teams, and they had built up really quite positive working practices. And they said clear benefits arose. These included greater capacity to individualize practice for the child, a greater potential to harness and implement the resources that are distributed amongst members of the co-professional teams. So suggestive evidence, actually, there will be good stuff going on, but at the moment, we don't know. Language for All did not measure child outcomes. We got qualitative data on co-working, which told us a lot about good co-working. But did the children get? We just don't know. And where I'm going to finish this is by saying, well, what we need to do is implementation research studies, the kind of studies that take the complexity and messiness of practice on and look at the factors that should help intervention, probably only look at setups where you're likely to get good practice. And again, it was the point Eve made. If a school or a service is not ready to do this, don't let them. In many of the educational targeted services, including Talk of the Town, the head teacher decides. And the head teacher gets paid whether you're in the control group or the sort of upset cost, whether you're in the control group or the intervention group. So head teachers like it, but the rest of the staff may not have got a say there. And really, if you're looking at implementation research, you would check that out. And you say, well, we're not going to go there. And that's quite difficult to do in many contexts where you're supposed to be providing services for everybody. But if you know, or you feel, or your evidence suggests that it's just not going to be done, well, it's quite an expensive thing to be doing, for nothing, maybe. We did do a replication of the Strathclyde language intervention project. To say it didn't do well in schools, so we did a third study which said, why not? What is it that stopped people doing it? And we took teachers who'd actually done it who said things like, you started at far too high a level. You were talking about vocabulary and grammar, and we don't do that. And then we took it to people who hadn't had a chance to do it. They said, well, we couldn't do 20 minutes a day. We just never could. But we also built a timetable that would be an agreement. This is not only what you're going to do, but over these weeks, you have to decide when you're going to do it and who's going to do it. In other words, implementation will happen. All that kind of thing would be included. Obviously, one of the things that has to be included would be child outcomes. Now, these need not be language outcomes. Again, Eve mentioned participation and activity outcomes. There can be anything that you want to happen, but you've got to say beforehand and get it done. Child, family, and staff perspectives are terribly important, and staff perspectives are terribly important. Of these three, we do actually sometimes ask children and families, but asking other professionals can be quite difficult. And again, in the Strathclyde, the SLIP project, Language Intervention Project, at the end of the study, we asked the people who'd been delivering intervention, the therapists and the therapy assistants, a number of questions, but one was, do you think the teachers took your advice? Now, they'd been working with either small groups or individual children. So they answered for each child who'd been in their care, either in a group or individually. Do you think the child's teacher took your advice? And the answers were only three there could be. Yes, I think they did, with some nice examples. No, I don't think they did. They kept asking who I was and what I was doing, and things we'd gone over had to be go over again. But the biggest response, 60% of the respondents, and that's based on children, said, don't know. I actually don't know. And that's scary, because it means that even in that project, which is a very tightly controlled, manualized project, the therapists hadn't kind of liked to ask or made it even particularly clear that they would be quite happy if people let them know that they were going to or not going to do it. So I think that the whole things around staff perspectives, the teachers were very positive about the intervention, but the therapists hadn't kind of quite dared ask if they were going to do it. It's quite a bold question. Co-working practices certainly have to be investigated. We've got other definitions and ladders and ways of scaling them and looking at whether it's collaborative, cooperative, expert aid model, what is going on. And finally, in real-life intervention context, we need the randomized control trials, and we need the efficacy studies, but we also need to go sort of beyond that to the efficacy in, which could be in real-life context, but how's it actually going after? The drug companies would call it post-marketing studies. What happens when the thing goes into the field and gets used? Now, the academic cliche is to say we need further research. No point in doing that here, because actually the research is about to start. In Ireland, you have so got the project that needs to be done, and you're so ready, starting to do it. A thoroughgoing investigation, and this will fill many of the gaps in knowledge identified above. It's exactly what's needed, hence the title. It's probably not necessary to reiterate the importance, but I really can't wait to hear the results. Thank you very much.